Welcome to this How to Fix Your Slice series with HackMotion Golf. I'm excited about the series of videos you're about to watch. I'm going to take you through the entire swing with relevant checkpoints to look for from setup all the way through the backswing, transition, downswing, impact and follow through. If you slice the ball, I promise you the reason for your slice will be covered in this series, as well as a drill that will be specific to helping you eliminate that slice forever. I promise you, if you follow this series and the instruction contained within it, you'll no longer slice the ball and find yourself able to hit longer, more powerful shots than you ever have before. So we're going to begin this video series by quickly discussing the anatomy of a slice. What causes that ball to slice off to the right into the trees, never to be seen again? Well, it really comes down to the control of the club face, which ultimately is a wrist problem, and you need to understand what's going on at the wrist level. The HackMotion wrist sensor allows us to do that, and I'm going to be wearing the HackMotion throughout the entire series on my lead wrist to show you how the wrist is moving at all times. One thing to say is that you are twisting your wrists throughout the swing, whether you know it or not. A lot of the time you've learned a feeling that's just become familiar to you that feels very normal. It doesn't even feel like you're twisting the club at all. But I promise you, if you're suffering with a slice, then you are opening this club face excessively at some point during the swing. And as we go through this series, you'll be able to identify exactly where that's happening. We're going to begin with the grip. The very first thing we need to check is how we hold the club. When we take our grip, and I have a relatively neutral grip, which I'll get to shortly, explaining the differences in the grip. But when I hold the club with my left hand and with the HackMotion on my wrist, you'll notice I have a small amount of extension built into this wrist. That's a slight angle here between the forearm and the back of the wrist, and that would be desirable. That would be pretty close to a standard neutral type of grip. When you think about how you hold the club, the role of the hands is in part to produce a twisting or a force about this shaft. Now, the golfers who struggle the most with the slice would start to open the club face throughout the swing, and that would generally be associated with adding more lead wrist extension. You can see there, just by me spinning this club open, the extension number on the graph has gone to 49 degrees. You see the live avatar there of my wrist moving around. That's 51 degrees of extension, which is associated with an extremely open club face. If I was to twist the wrist in the opposite fashion, so move it in the other direction, this would be towards flexion. You'll now see that there's 14 degrees of lead wrist flexion. This club face now looks completely different and is no longer open. This is the type of thing that we're going to be striving for as we move into the swing itself, but we're going to start with the grip. Think about it like this: the more extension you start with in your grip, the more lead wrist extension you have in the beginning of the setup, like this, the greater range of motion that you have in order to twist this club face more closed. So if you slice, having more lead wrist extension at setup can be a benefit. This grip, when I turn my hand excessively to the right, would often be described in golf instruction as a strong grip. And the strong description of the grip really means it strengthens the club face. When you start with your hand turned, and both of your hands in this example turned to the right, you have the greatest chance of twisting the face more closed. So if you slice, one of the first things to look at is how you're positioning your hands. Oftentimes I see the poorest golfers who slice the ball the most, hit the ball the furthest to the right with the weakest, shortest distance. They start with the left hand grip turned too much to the left. You'll actually see here, as I place my hand on the club, there's 4 degrees of extension. That's basically a flat wrist. Now, the problem with that is I've got a great range of motion here available to me to open the club face more. But if I was to try and close the face much from this point, I've got an extremely limited range of motion. So really what we're doing at setup is positioning the hands in such a way that's giving us the greatest chance to turn or twist the face in the direction that we want to. So one more time, if you slice, the more you turn your hands, both your left and your right hand, to the right, and the more lead wrist extension you'd likely see on your HackMotion device, the more range of motion you have in terms of closing this club face, and the less chance you have of opening this thing further. There's much less range. So positioning your hands on the club and where you do it matters. The grip itself doesn't determine whether you'll slice or hook, because there's still lots that can happen during the course of the swing. But what we're doing here with the grip is trying to help you set up in a way that promotes the type of wrist movement that we'd be looking for if you're looking to eliminate that slice. So we've covered the grip to some extent and given you an idea of how to position your hands on the club in terms of encouraging the right movements. But as mentioned, the grip by itself doesn't necessarily eliminate the slice. In fact, I've seen lots of golfers who have grips that should be associated with closing the club face and even hooking the golf ball, who still slice it. So we need to do more, and we're going to build up to that and go through that throughout this series. The next thing we're going to do is, before we've even started to swing the club, is take that grip and understand how to position the hands and the club face and the shaft of the club at setup to once again encourage more of a draw shape. I mentioned before that the problem you have is an open club face, a club face that's open to the path of the swing. And what we want is a club face that's more closed, closed to the path. There's things you can be doing at setup to encourage that. So let's go ahead and take our grip. If we're going to encourage a slightly more lead wrist extension in the beginning, just to get this hand turned to help us. Once we've done that, what we can do is we can push the handle more forward and up. So you'll see that from both the face on view and down the line. Let's look at face on first. I'm going to push the handle more forward, so this lead arm and the shaft have more of a angle to them, this left arm and the shaft. And then from the down the line perspective, I'm going to take this shaft or this grip and raise it up like so. Doing those two movements helps to move this lead wrist into more flexion and starts to close the club face to the shaft. This is an extremely useful piece if you struggle with a slice. Setting up with the handle more forward and up closes the club face to the shaft, which is closing it, effectively closing it to the path, and this will help you to eliminate your slice. I've helped players get rid of lifetime slices, lifelong slices, just by changing this handle position at setup. It's a truly useful piece that many people disregard or don't understand. It's because when you raise the handle up, you move the lead wrist into more ulnar deviation. There's this downward movement of the wrist, which is also at the same time associated with more lead wrist flexion. In fact, you see on the avatar there with HackMotion, as I make this extreme high handle, I'm moving this lead wrist now into some flexion, and that's closing the face, which means if I hit the ball like this, there's no doubt this thing would draw or curve to the left. I can build in the draw at setup by going more forward and up with my hands and going ahead and hitting the ball. You watch how this thing will curve from right to left. That thing is never going to slice in a million years. So you can certainly incorporate these pieces and these feels into your swing. You'll see there on the HackMotion that it was suggesting I had too much lead wrist flexion at the top of my swing there, but I was using that drill, that feeling, as an example of what you would do if you were a slicer. So there you see that ball's curved nicely from right to left. So take this concept of how to hold the club first and foremost, but secondly, how to position the handle more up, more forward, to get you into a position where the draw is built in at setup. So now that we've covered the grip and how you can set up to help eliminate your slice, it's time to start moving this club around the body. And this is where obviously it starts to get more complicated and things can start to go wrong for so many of you. It makes a lot of sense to start with the backswing, but before I do, I want to just reiterate the point that despite what you might think and despite what you might feel, you are twisting this club throughout the entire time and space of the swing. What it probably feels like to you is that you're not doing that much at all, and that's because whatever swing you have has become just very familiar to you. So as you move this club around your body, you don't think to yourself that you're twisting the club at all. But you'll know from the shots you've hit with HackMotion and looking at the graphs that the truth is the wrists are always moving, and the likelihood in your case is that you've developed a feeling in your wrists that's unfortunately not optimal. It's not helping you to hit the shots that you want to. So as we move forward, understand that you're likely going to need to feel something that is quite a conscious movement or a conscious twisting of this golf club in a direction that's different from what you're used to. So if we start out, I think it's worth saying that there's two key checkpoints to look for in the backswing. The first one, once we've taken our setup here, the first one would be as we swing back to where the shaft is parallel to the ground in the backswing. This position I reference in my teaching system as P2, position 2. And again, I'll tell you it's where the shaft is parallel to the ground in the backswing. It's a nice little reference point that we can use for checking how the wrist and the club face is at this point in time. Ideally, when we get to P2, visually we're going to see that the club face, whether it's an iron or a driver, has a slightly downward look to it. So you'll notice how the leading edge of this club is somewhat pointing down, you could say towards the ball. That's a decent position for it to be. When it comes to HackMotion, we already know that when I set up, I'm going to have a little bit of extension in my lead wrist if my wrist is neutral, if my grip is neutral. And you'll see there that that's confirmed. As I hold the club, I've got 17, 16 degrees of extension. Now I'm going to move this club from setup. There's 18 degrees, 17, 18 degrees of extension. I'm going to swing back to P2 and I'm going to stop. And there's now 11 degrees of flexion. That's gone from 18 degrees of extension to 11 degrees of flexion. Let's call that 30 degrees of twist. 30 degrees of this wrist moving from extension to flexion. Now, just coming back to the point I made a minute ago, I don't feel like I'm twisting that golf club at all. But every time I use HackMotion, I see the same pattern. I'm fortunate that I've developed a feeling in my swing over years and years of practice that's optimal. That movement from setup to position 2 comes very, very naturally to me. I don't even have to think about it. But as I said to you, you've likely developed a different feeling. So if you swing back and notice that you haven't moved to flexion or you still have some extension in this lead wrist, you're also going to see that the club face is not pointing down, as I discussed or described, it's pointing slightly up. That's the first red flag that you're opening the club face in the takeaway. And very often I see this mistake because golfers are trying to swing the club more around them. You're told to stop your slice, you need to swing more from in to out. And I would agree with that to an extent, but not at the expense of opening the club face. As a golfer attempts to move the club more around them, they very often associate or accompany that with an opening or a rolling of the club face. You'll see here 29 or 30 degrees of extension opens this club face. So if you're checking on camera, the position of this club face at P2 matters. It's something you should pay attention to. If you really slice the ball a lot, you can look for the face of the club to point even more down. The more you flex the wrist, this is 41 degrees of flexion, the more I'm closing the face, and the less likely I'll ever be to slice the ball. So how you move that club from P1 to P2, from setup to shaft parallel matters. There's 15 degrees of flexion there. Check that when you swing. If you're getting this piece wrong, it's definitely the first place to start. And then the second place in the backswing, the second checkpoint, would really be at the top. So once we reach the top of the swing, what's the HackMotion telling us? Well, you'll see there that I'm maintaining or retaining that 15, 16, 17 degrees of flexion. That's really helping me to understand that my wrist is flat or slightly flexed. And what that's doing from a video perspective, so if you're checking this on camera, you'll see that at the top, when done correctly, there's that 16 degrees of flexion again. You'll see how the club face or the club head is to the right of the shaft as you look from the down the line camera angle. It's on top of the shaft effectively. This would be the opposite. The club face would be underneath the shaft or to the left of the shaft from this down the line perspective. And that open club face is associated with 42, 43 degrees of extension in my lead wrist. You can see my lead wrist now has this extension in it, and that's opened the club face. So these are the checkpoints we want to look for in the backswing. If you're getting these right and you're hitting the numbers that I've described, then you probably don't need to spend too long here. But if you're getting this wrong, this is definitely the first area to look at, because it's easier to monitor and manage what's happening in the backswing, because this is happening slower than the downswing. We'll get to the downswing next. But if you're not hitting these numbers in the backswing, focusing on the backswing will definitely help you. Especially this first piece from setup to P2, this is a slow part of the swing. And it's also a part of the swing where we can use our eyes to visually check how this club face looks and make a direct adjustment with the wrists accordingly. So backswing checkpoint number 1, P2, club face is pointing slightly down to the ground with the lead wrist moving into some flexion. And at the top, still maintaining that flexion number. So the wrist is in flexion, not extension. The wrist is in flexion. And from a visual perspective, that club face is positioned to the right of the shaft or above the shaft, as opposed to the left of the shaft or underneath it. Those are the key checkpoints you need to look for in the backswing. That will help you undoubtedly get the club face into a stronger, more closed position and help you to eliminate that slice. Okay, so we've made it to the top and we're going to start talking about the transition and the downswing. Hopefully up to this point you're hitting the checkpoints I've discussed, and if you are, there's no major concerns about what's happening up to this point. But if you're still hitting these checkpoints so far and slicing the ball, the likelihood is you're getting it wrong in the downswing. And I'll be honest with you, this is the area where I see the biggest deficiency and the biggest differentiator of skill between the highest handicap golfers who slice and the best golfers who hit those powerful draw shots. What happens in transition is hard to understand and change because it happens very, very quickly. It's also the point in time in the swing where you're putting the most force and power into the shot. You're trying to create speed that you think is necessary to hit the ball far. Unfortunately, for the slicers, it's generally the case that what you're doing at the top, and as you pull that club down, you're doing it in a way that's opening the club face. You just don't realize that that's what you're doing. Let me explain what I mean. So we're going to take our setup, got that little bit of extension we've already talked about. We're going to go all the way to the top, and we've got that wrist in flexion. I've got 17, 18 degrees there of flexion. Now, in the process of pulling this club back down towards the ball, and as I've said, trying to put some effort and some speed into this swing, golfers inadvertently twist the wrist. As they pull, they twist this wrist into extension. That would look like this. Pulling the club down with force, spinning the club face open, and now I've got 20 degrees of extension in this lead wrist. This is a huge problem. Once the club is this open in the downswing, you're left with no choice but to start hanging back and swinging across the ball, which ultimately will result in a slice. One pattern that is common among the best golfers, regardless of the number they have at the top of the swing, doesn't matter exactly what this number is at the top, the one thing they all have in common is that from the top of their backswing into transition, they move this lead wrist into more flexion. It moves towards flexion, as opposed to the slicers among you who will move it towards extension immediately. So this transition phase is absolutely key. I'll show you what that looks like if we do this correctly. So moving to the top, there's that flex number, 14, 13, 14 degrees. As I start down and move this club into the downswing, now I'm moving it into more flexion. That's 18, 17, 18 degrees. That's a movement towards flexion, which has the club face in a much better spot. As I've touched on, learning to see this, feel it, change it can be challenging because it happens so quickly. You've developed a feeling at the top of the swing which is extremely natural and familiar to you, but unfortunately it's probably opening the club face and causing you the vast degree of your problem. But what you can do, and do it slowly to begin with using HackMotion, is you can get to the top and take a look at this checkpoint. There's 17 degrees of flexion, and then practice spinning or twisting the club into more flexion. As I do it slowly like that, it's quite easy for me to feel, but I'll also make the point one more time that you're going to likely need to feel like a very conscious, very specific twisting of the grip. That won't necessarily be familiar to you at all. That will feel very new. So it's important you do it slowly, and it's important you use the live feedback of the avatar to go from that flex condition to more flex. That will help you tremendously, regardless of what club you use. This is the biggest mistake or the biggest area that I see high handicap golfers, slicers of the golf ball struggling to do correctly, and yet the best players do this effortlessly. This is really the biggest differentiator of skill between golfers who slice and golfers who draw. So if you're looking for that possible area where you're struggling, take a look at that point in time in your swing. In a minute, I'll share with you some things to look for on the graph of your HackMotion data, just to help you highlight that piece more correctly, more accurately, and help you to use the HackMotion data in a more efficient way. Before I do that, the second checkpoint in the downswing is something that we can also talk about. By the time we get this club to parallel to the ground in the downswing, you remember we talked about parallel to the ground in the backswing. In our backswing video, that was P2, like this. I told you that club face needed to be pointing slightly down. Well, that same checkpoint in the downswing, now the shaft is parallel to the ground again, but this is now the downswing. This position is referenced as P6 or position 6. I need to look for similar pieces. Number one, the club face is pointing slightly down. That would be consistent with keeping the lead wrist in some flexion. That would be consistent with keeping the club face closed to the path, which would help me hit a draw. So that's the first thing to look for on the camera. On your HackMotion, you're looking for the fact the lead wrist is still in that flexed condition. And another checkpoint visually on the camera from down the line is that the club head is ever so slightly inside or behind your hands. The opposite of that would be the club head or the club shaft being outside of your hands at P6, where the shaft is parallel to the ground. This picture would be associated with a golfer who swings across the ball excessively, and that swing path would also be consistent with somebody who has the club face open. So done incorrectly, if you watch yourself on the video, you'll see at the top, you pull down and start to extend this lead wrist. There's 23 degrees of extension there. Club face is getting more and more open, it's pointing up to the sky rather than down towards the ground. At P6, the club face is pointing up and the club head is outside my hands, and now I'm determined or destined to swing across this thing. That would look like this. So I can feel immediately off the club face that ball sliced off to the right. High slice with very little power, okay? Too much extension as I pulled down. Now, if I go ahead and do the same thing, but this time go through the correct process at the top. So set up to this ball, get to the top, there's some flex in that wrist, 8-9 degrees, move it into more flexion coming down. Practice that twisting in transition. I've got the club here in the perfect delivery spot now. 99% of the work is done. If your club looks like this at P6, your wrists are flexed, your club face points down, you've done 99% of the work. It's basically all there for you. You're very unlikely, almost impossible to slice from this position. So if I get the work done at the top and in transition, go ahead and hit one. We'll see what that looks like. I can feel immediately that ball's going to curve in the opposite direction. There's my draw. We'll take a look in a minute at those shots on the HackMotion graphs for you to see what you should look for. But understand the downswing, what happens in the downswing is vital. The challenges are that it happens so quickly, it can be difficult for you to feel and for you to change. But with the help of your HackMotion, you can measure what's going on with the wrists, really start to identify the area that you need to focus your attention on. So many of you will have hit shots with your HackMotion, but not necessarily taken too much time to look at the graph. And if you do look at the graph, you may not really know what to look for. I'm going to specifically highlight here the most important part of the wrist movement that I would say happens in the transition. So you need to take a look at the graph, and then you need to look at the line on the graph there, which represents the top of the swing. This graph I'm looking at here, the second shot I hit there, which was the draw shot, you'll notice how the graph from the top of the swing into the downswing starts to go down. Okay, there's a very clear movement down in that motion. That's the wrist moving towards more flexion. I told you that was consistent with the best golfers who hit the strongest shots, the draw shots. Those are the best players. That would typically be the pattern you see in the better golfer. If we take a look at the other shot I hit, the first one which sliced to the right, you'll notice that at the same point in time, so you take a look at that line that says the top of the backswing, you'll notice how the graph continues to move upwards. That's moving towards extension. So that's the slice pattern that we've spoken about. Just looking at that specific point in time on the graph can really help you if you're slicing. Make sure that your wrist is moving towards flexion as soon as you reach the top of the swing, that graph starts to go down, not up. If you can do that, you'll find that your slice becomes a thing of the past. So now we've made it to impact, which many of you will believe is the moment of truth. And of course, the golf ball gets its information from impact, so it does matter. However, impact can often just be a product of what's preceded it, what's happened in the backswing, and often the downswing will then determine what your impact position looks like. But there's still value in understanding what you should be looking for at impact. The most simple way to say this would be that at impact, from a wrist perspective, you want to have more wrist flexion than you had at setup. So the shaft would lean more forward. That would allow you to close the face to the shaft, as we described previously, get that nice shaft lean look, good contact, and hit that more powerful shot. The way that I would often get a player to feel this would be to build it in at setup. We talked about that in video number 2. But there's also going to be a drill that you can do at impact to enhance the likelihood of you delivering the correct wrist angles at impact. So what do I mean? Take our normal setup, that's that 15, 16 degrees of extension, and then move the handle more forward and up. You'll remember that from earlier. That gives me a sense there, that small amount of flexion that my wrist is in, it gives me a sense of how I'd want this to feel at impact. Okay, it gives me a sense of what I'd be looking for. So handle more forward and up. That's a nice sense of how the wrist should be when I hit the ball. Now the drill that I would prescribe for the player struggling with this would be to start out making small backswings, hitting the ball and stopping as soon as they can after impact, while retaining as much of that lead wrist flexion as they can. This is like a long chip and run shot, a long punch shot. So that would look like this. Stopping almost immediately after impact, where the wrist feels like it's stayed in all of that flexion. Now, the HackMotion graph there is showing me that I was in too much flexion at the top and too much flexion at impact. That's great. I want to see those numbers if I'm a slicer, because you see what that does to the ball. Helps the ball to curve from right to left and gives me that draw shape. So the exercise you're trying to do is putting that lead wrist flexion at setup, push the handle forward and up, and deliver the club with what feels like a very similar amount of flexion, really as much as you can. The data will tell you whether you're doing too much. The ball flight will ultimately tell you if you're doing too much. But if you're a slicer, someone who struggles to curve the ball at all from right to left, seeing that shot when you practice is very encouraging. You could gradually build up with this exercise, so keep pushing the boundaries of this, going further each time, going faster each time, while still trying to retain the sensation of the maximum flexion just after impact. So I'll hit this one a little further. This would be the progression of this drill. You'd make a bigger backswing. Okay, I'd go further back, but I'd still try to hit the ball with this maximum flexion feeling. I'll go ahead and hit one of those. I'm still trying to stop pretty quickly after impact. The likelihood is you won't be able to stop as quickly because there's more speed coming out. But again, you see that ball flight, that curve from right to left. I was able to produce the flexion. Again, the HackMotion data telling me it's far too much. And you'll see there on the ball flight that ball's curving too much to the left. I don't need to do this drill. I already hit a draw naturally. So when I exaggerate these feels, I close the face too much and I hook it. For you, that would be a wonderful shot for you to look at and see on the driving range when you hit the balls. And in order to achieve that, you're going to want to go for maximum flexion at impact and just after. Try that exercise and see how you get on. I'd encourage you to start out with that, doing this exercise with a smaller, shorter club to begin with. This was a 7-iron. You can use this for the driver ultimately, and we'll get into the driver later. But suffice to say, starting out with a slightly slower, smaller swing, you'd benefit from doing this with a shorter iron to begin with. This is one of my favorite drills. I call this the hit hard, stop quick drill, and it really helps to train good club face control, good shaft lean, and ideal impact alignments. When it comes to the ability to control your ball flight, it may surprise many of you to learn that what you do in the follow-through really matters. Oftentimes people will think that once the ball's been struck and it's flying through the air, what happens in the follow-through really doesn't matter at all, but nothing could be further from the truth. Learning to control where you stop this club and how you control the wrist angles will have a significant influence on the club face delivery and ultimately the direction of your shot. In the previous video, we spoke about the importance of delivering sufficient lead wrist flexion at impact and how that looked different to setup. So we were able to put in that forward and up shaft condition, and we hit some of those little punch shots, the hit hard, stop quick exercise that I am such a fan of. I prescribe that to so many golfers to start learning good contact and the ability to hit a tiny little draw shot like that. That ball's gone out there about 100, just over 100 yards, 116 yards, tight little draw. That's a fantastic exercise to start teaching you the correct delivery of the club at impact in terms of wrist angles and shaft lean. But if we wanted to extend that into a longer swing, something that would be more functional and usable on the golf course, then we need to learn how to transport that wrist condition of more flexed, more ulnar, more up like this, transport that condition into the follow through. So when I take my setup and we look at the live avatar there of HackMotion on the screen, you'll see that my wrist starts out in a little bit of extension, 7 or 8 degrees. I'm going to push the handle forward and up. Now I'm flexed quite significantly, and at 20 degrees, 18, 19 degrees of flexion, I want to try and transport that feeling into the follow through. It's 22 degrees there. I'm managing to retain that sensation as I move from impact into the follow through. That's very different to how most of you will be doing the follow through. Because this happens at so much speed, it's very hard for you to understand, but this club's flying through impact like this with the lead wrist moving rapidly into extension, opening the club face, laying the shaft back and swinging across the ball. There's your slice. So your ability to be able to transport this forward and up movement at impact into the follow through for as long as you can would be the recipe you need to keep that draw built into that shot. So if I wanted to hit the ball further with this swing, if I wanted to take this to the course, I'd want to feel like I had the most forward and up shaft feeling, and I'd take that all the way into the follow through. In my mind, I'm taking it through to where the arms and the club parallel to the ground. So you can use your HackMotion sensor to see if you're able to do that. Keep the flex in the wrist, keep the arms extended, don't have this wrist moving into extension. So the start point is hit hard, stop quick, which we covered in the last video. The progression is to go and make the swing longer while trying to transport that same wrist condition further into the follow through. Something like that, where the arms and the club are parallel to the ground. You'll see that ball's got that higher flight to it, slightly more of a draw shape. I did hit that slightly towards the toe, which would tend to increase the draw, but you'll notice the trajectory of that ball is much higher. I could play golf with that. And the curve is still from right to left. There's the draw that I'm looking for. That's gone 162 yards. This is a 7-iron. That would be functional. I could certainly play golf with that. The HackMotion is telling me that in that example, I actually had a little too much flex, both at the top and at impact. But I'd be looking for those alignments if I was a slicer. I'd want to see the fact that I'm able to exaggerate the flex, deliver more flexion than I need, and continue to keep that flexion moving into the follow through. Those are key checkpoints that you can use throughout the entire swing to eliminate your slice. And if you haven't been able to get rid of your slice up to this point, then hopefully this follow through checkpoint and follow through alignment has been the magic bullet you needed at the end. Thanks for watching the series. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to do one more video now that covers the driver. I know most of you, when you slice, struggle with the driver more than any other club. You'll be pleased to know the same alignments and checkpoints are valid, but I wanted to make sure I give you some information about the driver before we finish. So of course the driver is often the club that you struggle the most with when it comes to slicing. I hope you didn't fast forward your way through all the videos to just get to this one. This is literally going to be a summary of what you need to look for in the driver when compared to the other checkpoints that we've covered already in this series. But of course, the driver is the club that so many of you need extra help with. I'll point out one or two extra things with the driver that you need to look for, which I see people getting wrong when it comes to primarily the setup. So grip discussion is going to be the same as we had before. And then when it comes to setting up to the golf ball, this would be one of the biggest challenges I see and the biggest mistakes made by amateur golfers when it comes to slicing the driver. Because the driver, the ball position is further forwards in the stance. And as a golfer does that, they often have the handle pulled back too far behind the ball. And they often get their alignment of their upper body skewed to the point where now things are pointing to the left, which is going to encourage that out to in swing path. So when you look back at the video series, and I discussed at setup having the handle more forward and up, that applies with all clubs, as I mentioned, but it particularly applies with the driver. Making sure that you don't set up with the handle too far back, but that you push the handle forward and up. This is going to help you. This is going to help you keep the face closed to the shaft and help you draw the ball. At the same time as pushing the handle forward and up, you're able to close off your shoulders a little bit more, which encourages a more in to out swing path. That again would be very beneficial if we're trying to eliminate the slice. So handle more forward and up with the driver. All the other checkpoints are going to be the same. We're looking for the club face to be slightly closed at P2, putting in that flexion, keeping that flexion coming down, hitting with that nice flat lead wrist that we talked about before, and keeping that alignment into the follow through. Really, the driver is the same as all the other clubs. The problem is if you have a deficiency in your club face, i.e. you're opening it too much, that deficiency just tends to get magnified with the driver. It's not that you're not doing it with your other clubs, but because the club face here is so much flatter with little loft, any deficiency, any opening or twisting of this club face gets exaggerated and magnified as a problem. So what I would say when it comes to the driver is while the alignments and the checkpoints are the same, the feels can often need to be more exaggerated. That means that just because a moderate amount of twisting of the shaft in your backswing has helped you to eliminate your slice with your 8-iron or your 7-iron or even your hybrid, you're going to need a more extreme amount of twisting as a feel in order to eliminate the slice with the longer clubs. That's a very, very common instruction that I have to share with players. Just because in theory it's the same, in practice the feeling that you need to translate into the club can change from club to club, and I think that sometimes gets lost on players, particularly when we get to the driver. So once again, handle more forward and up, try to keep that alignment into the follow through. If I wanted to draw the ball, I mean I'm setting up to this thing right now, there's no way this thing can slice in a million years. Handle forward and up, keep the shoulders closed, transport this alignment into the follow through. That's the shape you would want to see if you were practicing like this. You'd want to see that nice right to left curve on your ball. HackMotion there tells me I had my wrists very much within range, which is good to see. And again, if you're not used to seeing that ball flight, starting to see an exaggeration of right to left curve when you practice is something you really want to look for, because I promise you, your ability to transfer this new feeling from the range to the course will also get diluted somewhat. So when you practice, you want to see the balls curving more from right to left, so that when you go and play, the fact that you're going to lose a little bit of this feeling and go back towards your old pattern means that hopefully you fall somewhere in the middle, a little bit like the Goldilocks syndrome. So the driver is the same. It's the same in theory. In practice, you may need to have a little bit more exaggeration, as I mentioned. It's quite a common piece that I need to share with players. But the alignments and the checkpoints that you should be looking for when it comes to measuring your wrists with HackMotion and filming your swing on the camera are identical to what we've covered already in this Fix Your Slice mini-series. Thank you for watching this mini-series in association with HackMotion on how to fix your slice. The goal of this mini-series is to help educate you on checkpoints that both at setup and throughout the swing you can be looking for as red flags, areas where your club face is getting too open and is ultimately resulting in you slicing the golf ball. I hope you were able to identify where your weakness was and that you're able to take the drills and the measurements prescribed in order to try and fix the problem. Thank you to HackMotion for letting me film these videos for you. I really hope the series was educational and, more importantly than that, practical drills and application that you can take to the driving range and ultimately to the course to help you eliminate that frustrating slice forever. Thanks for watching. Look forward to hearing from you soon.